Welcome to Short Story Scene. I'm your host, the storyteller, and here we have a tale called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 10. Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. I was born in the year 18 to the large fortune, endowed beside with the excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every guarantee of the honorable and distinguishable future. And indeed the worst of my failures was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I find it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high, and wear the more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to the profound duplicity of life. Many a man would have even emblazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with the almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exact nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was, and with even a deeper trench than the majority of men, served in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and invertedly on the hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distrust. Thus, so profound the double dealer, I was in no sense of hypocrite. Both sides of me were in the dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside the restraint and plunged in shame than when I labored, in the eye of the day, in the furtherance of the knowledge of the relief of sorrow and suffering, and that the chance that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly towards the mythic and the transcendental, reacted with a shed of strong light on this consciousness of perennial war among my members. With every day, and for both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to the truth, by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that a man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard to guess that man will be ultimately known for the mere polity of the malfarious incredulous of the dependent dozens. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advance infallibly in one direction, and in one direction alone. It was on the moral side and in my own person, and I learned to recognize that through the primitive duality of man, I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to either, it was only because I was radically both, and from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest that most naked possibility of such a miracle. I had learned to dwell with the pleasure and the beloved daydream on the thought of separation of the elements. If each, I told myself, could be housed in a separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable, and unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and the remorse of his more upright twin, and just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence of the hands of his extraneous evil. It was the curse of man that their incredulous vagues of thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness. These polar twins should be continuously struggling. How then were they dissociated? I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a sidelight began to shine upon the subject from a laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it had ever yet been stated the trembling immaterially, the this-like transience of the seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. Certain agents I found that have the power to shake and pluck back the fleshly vestment, even though wind must toss the curtains of pavilion. For two good reasons, I will not enter deeply into the scientific branch of my confession. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it but returns upon us with more unfamiliar and more awful pleasure. Second, because, as my narrative will make, alas, too evident, my discoveries were incomplete enough then that I not only recognized my natural body from the mere aurora of effulgence of the certain of the powers that made up my spirit, but managed to combine a drug which the powers should be dethroned from their supremacy in the second form, the countenance substated, none of the less natural to me because they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death, for any drug that so potently controlled the shock of the very fortresses of the identity might, by the least scruple of the overdose, or at the least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blotted out the immaterial tribuncle which I looked it into change. But the temptation of the discovery so singularly and profound and vast last overcome the suggestions of the alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from the firm of a wholesale chemist a large quantity of a particular salt which I knew, from my experiments, to be the last ingredient required, and late one accursed night I combined the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. The most raking pang succeeded, in grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of the birth or death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of the heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like mill race in my fancy, a solution of bounds, obligations, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself, at the first breath of the new life, to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, soul the slave to my original evil, and thought that in the moment braced the delight in me with wine. I stretched out my hands and exulted in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. There was no mirror at that day in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of the day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard. Within, the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder the first creature of the sort that were unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, and stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak of the theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to the most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, the least robust and least developed in the good which I had just disposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 of life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll, even as good shone upon the countenance of one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil, besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on the body an imprint of deformity and decay. And yet, when I looked upon the ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. This, too, was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes it bore a livelier image of a spirit. It seemed more expressed and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine. And in so far I was doubtless right, I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near to me the first without the visible misgiving of the flesh. This was, I take it, was because all human beings, as we met them, are commingling without a good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was pure evil. I lingered at but a moment at the mirror. The second and the conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption. I must flee before daylight for the house that was no longer mine, and hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. That night I had come to the fatal crossroads. Had I approached my discovery in the more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from the agonies of death and birth, I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine. It but shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within ran forth. At the time my virtue slumbered, my evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil and the other was still old Henry Jekyll, that incourageous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly toward the worse. Even at the time I had not conquered my aversions to the dryness of life or study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and it was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell in slavery. I had but to drink the cup of doff at once in the body of the noted professor, and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. I took the furnished that house in Soho, to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged as a housekeeper, a creature whom I knew well to be silent and unscrupulous. On the other side, I announced it to my servants that Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty and power about my house in the square and to parry mishaps. I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss, and thus, fortified, as I suppose, on every side, I began to profit by the strange amenities of my position. Men had before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasure. I was the first that could plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off the landings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught, and that I had always standing ready. And whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like a strand of breath upon a mirror, and there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures which I had haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use the harder term, but in the hands of Edward Hyde they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into the kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to any another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws, and insidiously relaxed in grasp of conscience. It was Hyde after all, and Hyde alone was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again in his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of infamy at which I thus convened, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it, I have no design of entering. I mean by no point the warning and the successive steps which me the chastised approach. I met with one accident which, as I brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, who I recognized the other day in person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them to the cachet drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when, by slipping my own hand backward, I had supplied my double with the signature, I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out of one of my adventures, had returned at the late hour, and woke to the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me, in vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In the vain, and I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was. that I was not wakened when I seemed to be. But in the little room in Soho where I accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde, I smiled to myself and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of the illusion, occasionally even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eyes fell upon my hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professionally in shape and size, and was large, firm, white, and comely. But the hand, which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light of the mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of dusty pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in the breast of sudden and startling as a crush of cymbals. And bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awoken Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theater, where I was standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but what use was it when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and in such a strange array, and 10 minutes later Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of the breakfasting. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall to the spelling out of the letters of my judgment. I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issue of possibilities of my double existence. That part of my life which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I were conscious of more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger that, if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntarily change be fortified, and the character of Edward Hyde becoming irrevocably mine. The power of the drug had not been always equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then I had been obligated on more than one occasion to double, and once, with infinite risk of death, it triple amount, and these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. Now, however, in the light of the morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had to late gradually but decidedly transfer itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worst. Between these two I now felt I had to choose. My two natures, that memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composed now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with a greedy gusto projected and shared the pleasures of the adventures of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, or but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than the father's interest. Hyde had more than the son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had the late begun to pamper. To cast it with Hyde was to die to the thousand interests of aspirations, and to become at the blow forever despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales. For a while Jekyll would suffer smartly in the fires of abstinence. Hyde would not be even conscious of all that he had lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. Much the same inducements, the alarms cast the die for any attempt of troubling sinner, and it fell out of me, as if it falls with the so vast the majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part, and was found wanting in the strength to keep it. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty and the comparative youth and light step, leaping impulses and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in disguise of Hyde. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity that I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of the approving conscience. But time began to last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. The praises of the conscience began to grow into the thing of course. I began to be tortured with the throes and longings of Hyde struggling after freedom, and at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical instability. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough of allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading of characters of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My evil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of the more unbridled and more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul the tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least before God, no man, morally sane, could have been guilty of the crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations. And in my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was it to fall. Instantly, the spirit of hell woke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasted delight from every blow, and it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by the cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit, and fled from the scene of these exercises at once, glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed up in the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho, and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers, Thence I set out through the lamplight streets in the same divided ecstasy of mine, gloating on my crime, light-headedly devising others in the future, and yet still hasting and still hearkening in my wake of the steps of avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it pledged the dead man, and the pangs of the transformation had not done tearing him, before Henry Jekyll, with his streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it from the days of childhood, when I walked with my father's hand, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality. At the damned horrors of the evening, I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me. And still between the petitions and the ugly face of the inquiry stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by the sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or not, I was not confined to the better part of my existence. And oh, how I rejoiced to think of it! With that willing humility, I embraced anew the restrictions of a natural life. With that serene renunciation, I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. The next day came the news that the murder had not been overlooked, that the guilty of the Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I had glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take this and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly, in the last months of the last year, I labored to relieve suffering, and you know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself, nor can I truly say that I wearied for the benefit of the innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but I was still cursed with my duality of purpose, and as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not that I dreamed of resurrecting Hyde. The bare idea that they would startle me to frenzy. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience, and it was an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation. There comes an end to all things, the most copious measure of filled at last, and this brief condensation of my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul, and yet was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I had made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Park was full of winter chipperings and sweet and spring odors. I sat in the sun on the bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors, and then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint, and then as in the turn faintness subsided, I began to be aware of the change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness and contempt of danger, a solution of the bounds of obligation. I looked down, my clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs, and had to lay on my knee with a corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the cloth lying for me in the dining room at home. And now I was common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, and known murderer thralled to the gallows. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that in my second character my faculties seemed sharpened to a point, and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus it came about that, where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand, a thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into his presence? And how should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part reminded to me. I could write my own hand, and once I had convinced the kindling spark, the way that I must follow become lighted up to the end. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best I could, and summoning and passing hansom, drove to a hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember, and my appearance, which was indeed comical enough. However tragic of fate these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face. Happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for in another instant I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as made the attendants tremble. Not to look did any exchange in my presence, but obsequiously took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of a murder, lusting to inflict pain. Yet the creature was astute, mastered his fury with a great effort of the will, composed his two important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, and that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward he sat all day over the fire in a private room, gnawing his nails. There he dined, still alone with his fears, and the waiter visibly quarrelling before his eyes. And thence, when the night was fully come, he set forth in the corner of a closed cab, and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. He, I cannot say I, that child of hell, had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot. Attired in misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of nocturnal passengers, these two base passions raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, sulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. When I came to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was the least but the drop in the sea of abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows. It was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream, and I came home in my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day, with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrought me could avail to break. I awoke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated and feared, and thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not the course forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before. But I was once more at home, in my own house, and close to my drugs, and the gratitude of my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost revealed the brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I seized again the indescribable sensation that heralded the change. I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took on this occasion of a double dose to recall me to myself, and alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had to be re-administered. In short, for the day forth, it seemed only by a great effort as of gymnastics, and only under an immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night I would be taken with a premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I now condemned myself, even beyond what I had thought possible to man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak both in body and mind, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of the transformation grew daily less marked, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, a soul boiling with causeless hatreds, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to be having grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll it was a thing of vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature that shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heired with him to death. And, beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the most poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as something not only hellish but inorganic. This was a shocking thing, that a slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead and had no shape should usurp the offices of life, and this again, that the insurgent horror was knit to him closer than a wife, closer than an eye, lay caged in his flesh, where he heard him mutter and felt it surge to be born. And every hour of wakeness, and in the confinements of some slumber, prevailed against him and disposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was a different order. His terror was of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide, and return to his subordinate station of the part instead of a person. But he loathed the necessity, He loathed the despondency into which Jekyll was now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he was himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portraits of my father. And indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. But his love of me is wonderful. I go further, I, who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him, when I recall the abjection and passion of his attachment, and when I now know how he feels my power to cut him off by suicide, I find in my heart to pity him. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me to prolong this description. No more has ever suffered such torments. Let that suffice. And yet, even as these, habit brought no alliteration, all but the certain callousness of soul, a certain acquaintance of despair, and my punishment might have gone for years, but for the last calamity which had now fallen, and which was finally served me from my own face and nature, my provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out for a fresh supply and mixed the draught. The elaborate ebullition followed, and the first change of color, not the second. I drank it, and it was without efficiency. You will learn from Pohl how I have had London ransacked. It was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was the unknown impurity which lent efficiency to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of my old powders. This, then, is the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts, to see his own face, now how sadly altered, in the glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end, for as my narrative has hitherto escaped destruction, it has been by the combination of great prudence that great good luck, should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it. Hyde will tear it to pieces, but if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumscription to the moment would probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spirit. And indeed, the doom that is closing on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue the hatred personally, I know how I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue, with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening, to pace up and down this room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? Gods know. I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is it to follow concerns another within myself. Here then, as I lay down a pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of the unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. And that concludes our tale, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, by Robert Louis Stevenson. If you like this content and like to support it, please head to Patreon. That is www.patreon.com/shortstoryscene. Thank you all for listening, and see you next episode. Bye!